Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dalaran, and in today's video we'll be talking about some of the nerfs that have happened on Shadowlands beta. This will be the very first video on Shadowlands that I can remember that will primarily focus on the nerfs for certain classes. There's a good chance that some of you guys have maybe decided on a couple different classes you're thinking of playing in Shadowlands. Maybe even certain specs for PvP, PvE, Mythic Plus, or anything in between. And there's a good chance that some of you have gravitated towards some of the strongest specs in the game that are absolutely busting through the meta. Of course, this is a beta, and Blizzard is going to be doing more finalized tunings, but however, some of you guys are simply DPS fiends, and you really want to hit on the best specs out there. In this video, we'll tackle some of the nerfs that Blizzard has done to sub-rogues, Destro warlocks, and Prot paladins, and talk about how these nerfs will affect these specs going forward into Shadowlands beta. So let's first hit up the most egregious example of a overpowered spec, the sub-rogue. Or at least, hopefully with these changes, it should be less overpowered. It's no deniability that sub-rogue is in an insanely good spot. I mean, a lot of us are happy that sub-rogue is doing well, but some of us would even say that maybe it's doing a little too well. In terms of PvP, it have had the potential to literally one-shot players, placing it in like an S-tier spec where you actually do damage far above every other spec with massive crowd control, mostly with the help of a legendary. It's not really a problem with the spec itself. A lot of us are happy to see Subtlety doing well and be a real competitor in single target combat where maybe Assassination might be dethroned. But this legendary item, Akari's Soul Fragment, is the item that has gotten nerfed recently. It now does 50% less effectiveness, as in the damage isn't going to be the same. The primary aspect of this legendary, however, that I think made it the strongest, well, for PvP of course the damage is going to be amazing. I mean, it's a free Shadow Strikes as you're going for cheap shots on enemies, so not only do you get a stun, you get a free Shadow Strike on top of it. But the fact that these Shadow Strikes also generated combo points, which allowed the sub-rogue to cycle through the combo points very quickly. Obviously, that's a lot more eviscerates. Also, maintenance of Slice and Dice as well as Rupture, very easy. But also, every single one of those combo points that spend into a finisher also reduces the cooldown of your Shadow Dance. So even more dances and a lot more uptime on your big bursty cooldown. So this hopefully should rein Subtlety back, and as many of you probably asking, will this make Subtlety completely awful? I don't think so. From the Sims right now, again, this is early numbers, but people have decided to see how this compares against other legendaries and other builds. It does bring the legendary more in line with the other builds. It'll most likely still be really strong and maybe even the best single target legendary for Subtlety going into Shadowlands, but in terms of its effectiveness, there's now a lot more room for you to pick and choose which ones are going to be good and which ones are not. In fact, I would say rogues actually have quite a good set of legendaries to pick from, and being able to only pick one good one because it's overpowered, I feel like would have been too limiting. Overall, sub-rogues I think are going to be just fine. The next spec that has hit our egregious list, and this one I just couldn't wrap my head around like how much fun this was, but how silly this was, is going to be Destruction Warlock. Now, there's a good chance in Battle for Azeroth, whether you PvP or PvE, you probably have heard that Destro warlocks are really strong, maybe even overpowered with all those corruptions. Going into Shadowlands, there was actually a Conduit that allowed you to play a mass infernal build that nets you incredible, absolutely astronomical amounts of damage. And the playstyle was also very simple. You would just drop Infernals on an enemy's head and then drop Rain of Fire as many times as you can to spawn even more Infernals. With a Conduit that would build up a buff that actually would do more damage, and with a bunch of Infernals surrounding the enemy, I mean, that was basically all the DPS you needed. With a set legendary, every 2 minutes you would summon all these Infernals and they would basically just do astronomical amounts of damage, whether it is single target or AoE. Pretty quickly Blizzard decided to cap it out, so even this one is getting nerfed by 50. But I don't think this one is going to hamper Destro warlocks by any measure. I mean, you're still summoning a lot of Infernals. They're still gonna do a lot. It's just one Conduit that's gotten nerfed in order to be able to facilitate more even numbers instead of having ridiculously astronomical numbers that'll most likely scale out of control as you get higher item level conduits. We all forget that certain conduits are actually going to have even more effectiveness, so Blizzard reducing it by 50 right now means eventually we should be able to get close to similar power we're having this early in Shadowlands. And this one was an interesting one, which has been with Protection Paladins. I'm surprised that there's a tank on this list because this tank actually can do a lot of damage. Protection Paladin is a spec I played a little bit here and there in BFA, but it's not something I'm super familiar with in Shadowlands, besides the abilities and the buttons and what most of them do. But the interaction for this legendary was interesting. It basically allowed Protection Paladins to be this very much a glass cannon, massive loads amounts of damage on the beta. And even testing it right now, it does seem that Protection Paladin still could do quite a lot of damage, whether to a boss, whether to a trash of enemies, but the damage it used to do in Mythic Pluses was unbelievable. This was a combination of a legendary as well as a conduit, so very similar situation like the Sub-Rogue and the Destro, but Blizzard decided to nerf both of those in relative value, where together the nerf for both of those abilities should tone down Protection Paladin damage by a bit. And let me be honest, the damage is actually kind of hilarious, the fact that a tank can do this much. It's not uncommon, like, you know, Protection Warriors in Battle for Azeroth being able to do a hefty amount of damage with AoE and Avatar, but for Protection Paladin to actually have competitive numbers for a boss fight, it's interesting. However, with these nerfs to the damage, I really hope Blizzard takes a second look at Protection Paladin, as the way that players have described to me the Protection Paladin in Shadowlands so far as a glass cannon. Now, I don't think a tank should really be described as glass. The phrase glass cannon means that you can do a lot of damage, but you're also made of glass. So it'll normally be a spec like a mage, for example, like Arcane, pop massive mad damage, but in terms of, let's say, PvP encounters, they fall over very easily. So certain of these specs and classes being glass cannons makes sense from a DPS perspective, but for a tank perspective, that'll be an interesting take. I'm really hoping that Blizzard does still pay attention to the tankiness of Protection Paladin. That's something I hope that they continue on in terms of iterating to make sure that it's still a reliable tank. Having a tank do a ton of damage is nice, but let's say if you're a Demon Hunter of BFA, where they can do a lot of damage but they don't really survive, I think it's going to be a lot harder for most players to get into the content. And with the way that Paladins have gone through in Shadowlands and some of the changes with certain abilities that are intermingled between one another, I'm actually a huge fan of Paladin and definitely want to check out the class once I can get some alts up and running. So as for Paladin, I have no idea how this really affects the spec, and I will be honest with you guys. But I'm really hoping if they are going for the glass cannon part, make it durable enough glass cannon where you still feel like a tank. I'm fine with a tank doing loads of damage, but it should still be a tank, not as much of glass. It's kind of interesting seeing the fact that Blizzard is doing some massive nerfs for certain legendaries or conduits, nerfing them by a whole 50%. And it's a good thing that they're starting to work on stuff right now, trying to find the most egregious examples of overloaded damage. I'm really hoping Blizzard also looks at some of the specs that are underperforming, certain specs that I feel like should be doing a little bit more damage that are just simply undertuned. So hopefully we'll see more updates in that direction in the next few weeks. But thank you guys so much for checking out this video. Let me know what you think about the fate of Sub-Rogues, Destro Warlocks, and Prot Paladins in this video, and I'll see all of you guys in the next one.